All right, I'm going to show you something weird in the U.S. Let's walk through it on the map together. Here's California. You've got Los Angeles and San Francisco, skyscrapers on the coast, major ports, all that. Makes perfect sense. Water nearby means people nearby. Now let's move north and cross into Oregon. Notice anything? Okay, if not, let's zoom in on the coastline. It's a long stretch of shore that looks like the perfect place for cities, ports, resorts, but here's the catch. It's empty. I mean it. Along the entire Pacific coast of Oregon and Washington, there isn't a single big city. Zero. To understand how crazy that is, here's a simple comparison. Seattle alone has more people than that whole massive coastline combined. Across hundreds of miles of shoreline, only a tiny fraction of the state's population actually lives there. But wait, isn't this supposed to be a dream location for any city? You've got direct access to the Pacific and trade routes to Asia. By all logic, there should be megacities here, but there aren't. People did the opposite. They pulled the region's biggest cities, Seattle and Portland, inland. You could even say they hid them. But from what? On the map, there are no enemies nearby, just the ocean and stunning nature. There's one problem, a huge problem. Nature made this coastline a place people just don't settle, no matter how tempting it looks. So what's the catch? Let's find out what's so wrong with this place and why nature basically drives people off the Pacific Northwest coast. Let's start with the fact that we don't even have to travel to this coastline to know something's off, and for that, we can thank sailors. They already did the scouting for us. For a couple of centuries, mariners have been calling the waters off the coasts of Oregon and Washington the graveyard of the Pacific. It's literally a stretch of ocean where ships vanished by the dozens, and later by the hundreds. There's only one question. What the hell's going on out there? Let's zoom back out to the map and poke around right here. This isn't a sheltered bay or a calm gulf. This is the open Pacific, slamming straight into the shoreline with nothing to slow it down. It's a perfect storm of problems. Long ocean swells, winter storms, and then there's fog that can hang around for weeks. But that's not even the worst part, because there's one place where nature decided to go extra hard on the west coast. The mouth of the Columbia River. Let's take a look at what's happening there. Look, a massive river is pushing water out into the ocean, and the ocean is pushing right back in. What does that mean? Currents are colliding, the seabed keeps shifting. Waves turn short and steep like a mean churning knot of water. A ship can lose control in minutes, but even that doesn't fully explain the graveyard, because then the coastline finishes the job. The west coast of the U.S. isn't a laid-back beach you can sprawl on. It's cliffs, headlands, and submerged reefs. Drift off course in a storm, and a few minutes later, you're getting thrown onto the rocks like a tin can. I'm not exaggerating, and here's why. This is the stretch around Tillamook Bay in Oregon. You pass the Columbia River mouth, run along the entire Washington coastline, and keep going toward Vancouver Island. Altogether, it makes a zone like this. So what makes it interesting? Well, over the past couple of centuries, this place has destroyed roughly 2,000 ships. That's not normal, because that would make sense in the 19th century, but not in the 21st. What about GPS, radar, satellites? Shouldn't everything be under control now? Turns out, not even close, because the ocean always wins. You might know the route, but you never know how hard the next wave is going to hit, and I haven't even started talking about what the Pacific does to the land itself. It takes bites out of the Oregon and Washington coastline every single day, and that's where the story gets even worse. Yeah, just when it feels like things can't possibly get worse, nature makes its next move. It stops fighting the ships and starts fighting the land itself. So what's going on here? Take the Pacific Ocean. It's a brutal force. It hammers the coastline relentlessly, and during major storms, the U.S. can lose several yards of shoreline in one go. What does that mean for a house sitting right on the water? To see the full picture, let's rewind to the late 90s. This is Beverly Beach, and this is Glen Eden Beach. A string of storms hit, and the shoreline retreated by roughly 20 to 30 feet. Homes that had been a safe distance away one day suddenly ended up right on the edge. People either move the buildings inland or spend obscene amounts of money trying to reinforce the coast. But that was a while ago. What about now? Look at Nescowan, a small coastal town. For decades, the ocean has been chewing through the protective dunes. And during the storms in 2016 and 2021, waves reached the houses. Foundations got exposed, yards disappear. And it's not just because someone built too close. The coastline is literally shifting. So how does the ocean pull that off? It's simple. In winter, powerful storm systems roll in. Massive surf is normal. The waves don't just wash over the beach, they slam into the base of the cliffs and undermine them from below. It's like pulling bricks out of a wall. Everything looks fine until, boom, the whole thing collapses. And there's another trick. During intense cyclones, the ocean effectively rises. The sea level gets pushed above a normal high tide. Waves reach places they couldn't touch on calm days. Roads, dunes, even house foundations. That's when the ocean can bite off several yards of coastline in a matter of hours, with no warning. At this point, it starts to look like nature has a personal grudge, doesn't it? And we haven't even talked about what's happening on land, because the shoreline isn't the only place where nature's going wild. What do the perfect shores for a megacity usually look like? A wide strip of flat land, room for highways, neighborhoods, ports, the classic setup. Now let's look at Oregon. Sure, it has a long Pacific coastline. Sounds great, right? Until the Oregon Coast Range shows up on the map, and that's it. No more good news. Here the mountains push almost right to the ocean. On one side you've got water, on the other hills, forests, and constant elevation changes. Where is this city supposed to grow? Stretch out as a skinny ribbon along the shore? Slam into a slope? There's just no space for that. Now let's look at Washington. It's not any better. If anything, nature went overboard. The Olympic Peninsula blocks the coast, a full-on mountain mass that practically runs straight into the ocean. In some places, there are only a few miles between the waterline and serious uphill terrain. For a megacity, that sounds simple. There's nowhere to build. But wait, people build cities in mountains all the time, right? So why are we acting like nature specifically hates this coastline? It all comes down to the shape of the terrain. The slopes rise suddenly, the valleys are narrow, everything is jagged and squeezed tight. In short, there's no room to build here. None. Still, bad geography isn't always a final verdict. Sometimes a couple of strong transportation corridors are enough to make logistics work, and once logistics work, everything else can follow. So the obvious question is, what's the road situation on the Oregon and Washington coasts? At first glance, everything looks perfect. From north to south along the entire coastline runs US Highway 101. Seems like this is the salvation. Any coastal town is automatically plugged into the U.S. transportation network, connected to neighboring states, open to trade and growth. But there's a catch, and it's a big one. US 101 isn't a highway in the way most people imagine. For most of its length, it's a narrow two-lane road carved out of the landscape. It constantly twists between the ocean and the slopes, climbs and drops, snaps into sharp turns. Straight sections are rare. The road skirts hills, backs away from cliffs, crosses river mouths, then swings back toward the water. Beautiful views? Absolutely. Fast driving? Nope. In many places, the road hugs the edge of steep drop-offs. On one side, forested slope, on the other, the ocean or a deep bay. Shoulders are tight. There's almost no spare space. Want to widen it into a real high-speed route? Not really an option. You're basically choosing between blasting rock or pushing into the water. And that's not even the full list of problems. On the Oregon coast, there are the mouths of many rivers. So how does the road handle that? With long, narrow bridges, many built back in the first half of the 20th century. For tourists, local trips, and seasonal traffic, they're perfect. But for nonstop heavy freight flows, not so much. And without that, you don't get a major city or a major port. So where does this lead? To a pretty predictable outcome. US 101 is a very dangerous road. Seriously, it regularly shows up on lists of the most dangerous roads in the US, and not because of a couple of bad spots, but as a pattern. On some stretches, the average is around 34 fatal crashes a year. Doesn't sound great, right? But there's more. When analysts compare crashes by state and major routes, US 101 comes out with the highest number of fatal collisions among Oregon's primary roads. And if you set aside human error, the terrain itself is the main reason the numbers are so grim. But hold on, nature isn't done punishing the US West Coast yet. Let's talk about the climate, because that's yet another problem here. Look, there's a city in Oregon called Astoria. Locals will tell you without blinking, we live in one of the wettest places on Earth. And no, this isn't the tropics. It's just that water is a constant presence in everyday life. Let me explain. Every year, Astoria gets about 67 inches of precipitation. If that number doesn't mean much to you, that's 2 to 3 times more than in the drier parts of the U.S. and more than big cities like New York or Chicago. And it's not like you get a few downpours and that's it. The rain is spread out generously and pretty evenly. Now convert that into days and it becomes even more obvious. On average, there are 190 to 200 days a year with at least some precipitation. Nearly every other day, there's rain or fog. So where's the sun? Off chilling somewhere far away. In winter, Astoria may only get about 4 hours of sunshine per day on average. That's noticeably less than most temperate places. Gray skies here feel like the default setting. In short, kind of depressing. But fine. Oregon's one thing. Maybe Washington's better? Get your umbrella ready there too. On the Olympic Peninsula, average annual precipitation can reach about 66 inches. And the number of days when you really don't want to leave home without an umbrella is often 160 to 215 per year. Again, almost every other day. And it's all the ocean's fault. But how? The ocean is basically a giant moisture factory. Warm air over the water keeps soaking up moisture, then moves inland, and there it runs into hills, cliffs, and mountain ranges that sit parallel to the coast. The air has nowhere to go but up. It rises, cools down, and that moisture turns into rain, drizzle, and fog, day after day, year after year. And sometimes it can get way worse. Look, there's something called atmospheric rivers. Basically, they're long, narrow corridors of moisture in the atmosphere that stretch from the ocean toward land, like invisible rivers in the sky. They can run for thousands of miles and carry as much water vapor as multiple regular rivers combined. When one of these sky rivers hits the Oregon or Washington coast, the outcome is predictable. Moist air rises, cools, and then all that water comes down as rain or snow. But what's the big deal? The problem is the scale of it. When the atmospheric river slams into the coast, the rain turns into a short-lived but insanely powerful surge. And the smartest strategy is often simple. Wait it out and don't try to be a hero. You don't have to look far for an example. In 2025, one of these systems hit Washington and Northwest Oregon. In just 72 hours, more than 10 inches of rain fell. That's a lot of water in a very short time. What do you think that leads to? Pretty predictable things. Flooding. Emergency services declare states of emergency, people are evacuated, transportation shuts down. Water just shows up and takes over anything that sits below the safe line. And here's the uncomfortable part. This isn't rare, and it's not a once-in-a-century anomaly. The coasts of Oregon and Washington practically attract atmospheric rivers. They come again and again, and floods come with them. But you know what another problem is? Atmospheric rivers don't just dump rain on coastal areas, they often act as the catalyst for something even more serious, rivers spilling out of their banks. And that's where things aren't funny anymore. Oregon and Washington's coastline is carved up by rivers. When it pours for several days straight, the soil saturates fast and the rivers simply can't handle the incoming flow. In the end, water levels rise within hours, and suddenly water's pouring into city streets, farmland, and roads along the river corridor. Has this ever turned into a real crisis? Of course it has. Take the Columbia River, one of the most famous rivers in the region. It runs along the Oregon-Washington border and has a long history of overflowing. During the 1948 flood, water inundated Portland and Vancouver, and the low-lying valleys ended up under about 3 feet of water. And that wasn't a one-off disaster. In 1964 and 1965, after relentless rain, the river rose nearly 26 feet above normal and flooded huge areas again. Okay, big rivers are an obvious concern, but maybe smaller creeks and streams aren't as dangerous when the heavy rain hits. Unfortunately, it's the opposite. Small coastal rivers and creeks react even faster. In Oregon, Nescowan Creek, and in Washington, the Skokomish River can rise by several feet in a single day during prolonged rainfall. The outcome is obvious: flooded roads, submerged lowlands, and homes that were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. So what do we get in the end? Rugged terrain and nonstop rain. On their own, each one is bad news, but together, they're the perfect proof of how little nature seems to care for the West Coast. But what happens when you stack it all up? Well, let's find out. And here's a spoiler right away. It feels like nature has something stronger than just hatred. Now we jump to Ecola State Park on Oregon's northern coast, December 2025. The slopes along the park road, winding through tight coastal hills toward the ocean, suddenly started acting like they had a will of their own. The ground cracked, layers shifted, the soil began to creep downhill, slowly but relentlessly. The road buckled into waves, split with fractures, and the ground beneath it lost its support. And that was only the beginning. Then the landslides intensified. They blocked the park's only entrance, made the area dangerous, and severed utilities, including the water line. The park was left without running water, which raises the obvious question, what's going on with Ecoless State Park right now? Everyone was evacuated and the entrance was shut down. The administration fenced off the area because the hillside kept moving and could collapse even more. Eventually, the park was closed, and there still isn't an exact reopening date. A frustrating situation, to put it mildly. But why did this happen in the first place? It comes down to what Oregon and Washington's coastal slopes are made of. The soils here often consist of loose sedimentary deposits, layered clay, and weakly bonded shale. These materials aren't stable to begin with, and once water seeps into the cracks and pores, things get worse fast. After sustained rain, the rock and soil lose strength, grow heavier, and start to slide. The result is predictable. Landslides and slope movement that literally cut the ground beneath roads and trails. Okay, one incident. Stuff happens everywhere, right? Except even within this park, it's far from the first time. Geologists note that these slopes were active in 1961, 1975, 2016, and 2024. Landslides and collapses here aren't an exception, they're basically the pattern. But maybe it's only this one spot? Not at all. Stories like this are routine along much of the Oregon and Washington coast. Regular landslides occur along U.S. Highway 101 where sections have collapsed, slumped, or been shut down over the years because the ground wouldn't stay put. In the winter of 2025, a major landslide hit near the town of Siletz. It destroyed part of Oregon Route 229 near the coast, wiped out 3 homes, and sent debris sliding straight into the Siletz River Valley, blocking the road for a long time and cutting off access for vehicles and emergency crews. And Washington State Department of Ecology says that, plainly, landslides are common, and many stretches of coastal bluffs are considered hazardous zones where ground movement can happen every year, especially after heavy rain. It feels like Oregon and Washington's coastline has taken enough punishment already, but nature says no and makes it worse. This region sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire. What does that mean? Let's break it down. So the Pacific Ring of Fire isn't just a line on a map or a catchy term. It's a vast arc of active faults and volcanoes that wraps around nearly the entire Pacific Ocean. About 90% of the world's earthquakes happen here, and more than 75% of active volcanoes are concentrated along it. And the U.S. West Coast isn't some quiet edge of the system, it's a full-fledged part of it. But what does that mean, specifically in Oregon and Washington? The key hotspot is a region called Cascadia. Here, the Juan de Fuca Plate is slowly but relentlessly sliding beneath the North American Plate. Slowly means just a few inches per year, but the speed isn't the point, the way of movement is. The plates don't glide smoothly, they can lock for decades or even centuries, building stress, and then release it all at once. And that's when the consequences turn truly catastrophic. The last major release happened in January 1700, an earthquake with a magnitude of around 9. Parts of the coastline suddenly dropped, coastal forests were flooded, and a tsunami traveled all the way to Japan, where it was recorded in written chronicles without any idea where the wave had come from. That matters. The event was so powerful that its effects were felt across the entire Pacific. But that was a long time ago. So is Oregon and Washington calmer now? Not really. In February 2001, a magnitude 6.8 earthquake struck the Puget Sound region of Washington. Nearly a minute of shaking, major damage, $1 to $4 billion in losses, about 400 injuries, and 1 death caused by a heart attack. The shaking was felt in Washington, Oregon, and even British Columbia. And that still wasn't the worst-case scenario. So what happens next? The answer is nobody knows. But experts agree on one thing: Cascadia hasn't released its built-up strain. It's still storing energy, and the question has stopped being if and become when. And here's a pause to clarify an important point. Plate movement doesn't only mean earthquakes. Very often it also means volcanism. So how are Oregon and Washington doing on that front? Well, these states know exactly what volcanic disasters look like. Let's jump to 1980. Washington State, Mount St. Helens. Snow on the summit, dense forests on the slopes. It looked calm, almost picture perfect. A magnet for tourists and locals. What could possibly go wrong? The problem is, Mount St. Helens is a volcano. In March 1980, earthquakes began along with small gas releases. The mountain was basically hinting that something was coming, and soon that hint became impossible to ignore. On the morning of May 18th, a powerful earthquake hit the north flank. It triggered a massive landslide. Part of the summit literally collapsed. And then, the real disaster began. An explosive eruption followed. Huge volumes of rock, gas, and ash blasted outward at incredible speed. The ash cloud rose to about 10 miles high and spread hundreds of miles across the region, darkening the sky and cooling surface temperatures. That's higher than most planes fly. At the same time, muddy debris flows tore downhill, flattening forests and anything in their path. Pyroclastic flows burned and shattered the surrounding landscape. What did it lead to? Hundreds of square miles of forest and farmland were destroyed. The Toutle River flooded with mud and ash, washing out roads and bridges. Highways, rail lines, and utilities were wrecked. Dozens of small towns and farms were buried under ash and sludge. Ash fell across Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and beyond, disrupting travel, harming health, and damaging ecosystems. For weeks afterward, fine ash still lingered in the air, making it dangerous for breathing and for agriculture. And you know what's the most unsettling part? Oregon and Washington have many volcanoes. Most are considered dormant, but some show signs of activity. Volcanologists say an eruption isn't likely in the near term. Still, who knows when nature will remind everyone that it really hates the West Coast?